The link between an employee and his employer is far more complex than what's stated on the contract. Both parties have a whole set of unwritten expectations that they consider to be part of the deal. And to not meet these expectations can turn into a source of conflict. That has been Professor Denise Rousseau's field of research for about 30 years now. She calls it the psychological contract. Xerfi Canal had the chance to meet her after her conference at la journée de la FNEGE to find out more and to ask her what she thinks about what could be considered as a case study, the battle between trader Jérôme Kerviel and the Société Générale bank. Denise Rousseau, thanks for joining us on Xerfi Canal. Today is la journée de la FNEGE during la semaine du management, and you are here to talk about your field of study, which is psychological contract. Could you define briefly what is the psychological contract for people who are not familiar with your work?
Yes. A psychological contract is a deal in the mind. It's a person, an individual's understanding of what they, let's say in an employment situation, what they owe an employer and what they can expect in return from that employer over time. So it's basically a belief about what the deal is between
it's
a person and
rules,
another.
Unsaid rules between the firm and the employee?
Often it's based on unsaid rules, but it also comes from what's written in the handbook, what are the common practices, what's the incentive system, does seniority seem to bring rewards to people, which would be sort of a signal that, oh, if you reward seniority, you're going to keep me until I gain those benefits from seniority. So people can interpret a commitment, an obligation on the part of the employer if they do certain things in return, and that would be a psychological contract.
What are the main differences between a psychological contract in the US and overseas, more specifically maybe in France?
Well, that's always been an interesting question in my mind. I've long studied and observed the employment situation in France and thought about it relative to North America. I think I'll say, in the context of France, my sense is there's more parties to the psychological contract than there might be, certainly in the United States. And by which I mean you have the employer and the employee, and maybe the supervisor representing the employer, but you also have the state and the role of unions and other players in the market, in the labor market and in the labor institutions. That means then not only is creating the contract and people's understanding somewhat complicated because it's multiple parties, but also change is much more difficult because there's more need for alignment across different contract makers. Far fewer contract makers in the US. Even in unionized companies, the deal does fundamentally rest to a great extent on the interaction people have with their immediate manager and what he or she represents as the company.
You've been studying this psychological contract for about 30 years. What has changed since the 80s?
Wow, well, a lot has changed.
I guess so.
A lot has changed. It used to be, way back when, that we could pretty much summarize when we did interviews or surveys or focus groups, we could pretty much summarize the mix of contracts that would exist in a set of companies or with a group of employees or managers in an executive program. We could pretty much summarize the kinds of deals that they believed were part of their employment arrangements in two types. It's a transaction, you know, fair day's work, fair day's pay, totally arm's length arrangement, or it's a relationship and you join and you have a long-term future, more like a marriage in terms of how the people who are party to the psychological contract, that's a relationship, have open-ended expectations, are more willing to do broad and different things over time, and expect a lot more in return, especially expecting that their needs will be met even when they change. Today, there's much more heterogeneity. And what that means is, I mean, there are people walking around in organizations who've got a deal that's a hybrid. Partly it's about short-term deliverables, but they also expect to stay in the organization for the foreseeable future, and they're willing to make an investment in the organization for the future. You say, well, how did that hybrid come to be? And very often it's because the organization is investing in developing people to have certain kinds of competencies that they're willing to pay them to develop and they want to be able to use over time. People know it's not forever, but the investment in their competencies signals to somebody, well, they're probably not going to fire me tomorrow. And so therefore you have a sense of, well, the market's shaping the kind of arrangement I have with the company, but it's not an unstable relationship. It's one that will continue. And as long as you have some possible future, people are much more willing to commit, do more, respond to the needs of the other party than if they think there's no future.
How about the future? What evolutions can we expect in the next years for this psychological contract?
Well, in addition to the hybrid version, you know, that we're going to see more mix and match between kind of longer term arrangements and short-term deliverables and the need to adjust. One of the things that we see a lot, this is both in the US as well as in the other place where I do a good deal of research, which is China. We're starting to see more contracts that are, I guess I would say, bottom-up kind of contracts. So the old relational contract came in companies from, well, we have seniority and we have pay that goes up over time and you have job ladders you follow. And there were some practices that sent a very clear signal to people about what they should do and what they would get if they indeed performed as they were expected to. Today, because there's a lot more uncertainty inside organizations and strategies change, or we can say in a lot of companies strategies drift. You know, they're between strategies. People are uncertain what's really the case. Top management hasn't necessarily articulated a clear idea, may not have a clear idea. That what we often then see are circumstances in which people in their own jobs start making sense of, well, how do I make this work for me? What do I need to do to be a little more secure, to get the assignments I want, because maybe I can't stay here forever, but that assignment is interesting to me or it'll build my skills. And so in effect, people are constructing their own understandings of what the exchange is, which would mean that 2 or 3 individuals working in the same area might have somewhat different understandings of the deal because they're creating them out of their own preferred ways of working or their own longer term interests. So rather than be top down, they're bottom up. And what this leads the employer to have to do is to negotiate with individuals, not in a group form, but as individuals with different interests in trying to make sure that the people they have inside the organization are actually producing the work or accomplishing the task the employer cares about, because they've left so many things unmanaged. So you have to create individual deals. That's be the core idea.
One last question, Denise Rousseau. All of what you said makes me think a little bit about the Kerviel case, which are both parties fighting over responsibilities that are in this psychological contract, unwritten rules. What's your take on that case?
Well, I think one of the issues with Sakchen is the unanticipated effects of building a very powerful incentive system whose kind of potentially logical down the road implications have not been thought through. One of the strongest sources of beliefs about what I should do in my role or what's expected of me in my psychological contract is indeed the formal reward or incentive system. And in an organization that offers mostly financial incentives and maybe not a lot else to bind the person, to bind the employees to the company, those incentive schemes become big drivers. And in effect, The organization might say we wanted one thing and we got another, but they designed that system to produce something other than what they say they wanted. They designed the system, not the individual in this case. So there is a culpability.
Showing all the importance of this psychological contract. Denise Rousseau, thank you so much for joining us on Xerfi Canal. Thank you for your time.
Merci Thibault.